John chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. We no longer live in a world which we believe to be subject to magical forces. One of the many blessings of science is that it has rescued us from living in a world of unpredictable events of supernatural origins, of supernatural creatures and supernatural fears. And yet, although we live 300 years after the scientific revolution that began to dismantle that magical universe, superstitious beliefs can still have an unhelpful hold on our lives. And the story of this paralyzed man can help us gain some insight into how this works. When we first meet him, 3 things are dominating his life: suffering, superstition, and also victimhood. When we think about his suffering, once again, we are confronted by a tragic picture of the human condition. This man's situation is truly miserable. His suffering is huge, and it's made worse by the frustration of not being able to get into this water, which he believes when it's stirred up will heal him, if only he can get in there. And this is really pointing us to his superstition. He stayed next to that pool because he believed in the magical power of the water to heal him. The world of this man was a magical one, and it's easy to see why he would create such a world for himself, not just because the culture of his day encouraged it, but also because he desperately wanted to be healed. He couldn't accept his condition, and I guess who could judge him for this? People turn to superstition because of the difficulties of living in a fallen world. When we do this, we're motivated by a couple of things: the need to make sense of the world, and of course, the need to escape from our suffering. I suppose the capacity for magical thinking, it's a relic from our childhood, when magical stories and magic-themed play was such an important part of the development of our imaginations. And in times of great uncertainty or suffering, this relic can come alive once more and convince us that magic and not reason, not the principle of cause and effect, will determine the course of our future. And this man was subject as well to victimhood. He was a victim of a misplaced hope. His superstition created a hope that was out of touch with reality. No matter how many times his hope was disproved by experience, yet his need to hope was so powerful that he surrendered himself to its superstitious and false promises time and again. He'd done this for 38 years. He was trapped, unable to move on. Now, for me, this man stands as a metaphor for how we also can become trapped by our misplaced hopes. Perhaps our situation is not as desperate as this man's is, but similar forces can be at work to keep us locked in unhelpful situations. An example of how this misplaced and magical hope that traps us in unhelpful situations is to be found in our personal relationships. At work, in our communities, in our churches, and in our homes, we can be victims of the same kind of misplaced and even magical hope. I'm speaking here about relationships that aren't working in some way, that frequently leave us feeling bad about ourselves or angry with others. These are really difficult situations to live with, and yet we can often get ourselves trapped into reenacting the same kind of behavior in those relationships, even though it always produces the same kind of result, which leaves us feeling bad or frustrated or even worse. But not only do we stay in those relationships, we continue to repeat the behavior. We continue to relate in the same way as though it will somehow magically produce different results. We do this, of course, because we're searching for meaningful relationships, perhaps even intimacy and love. But all we get is hurt. We're trapped in an ever-repeating cycle of relationship failure, but always hoping that it will magically change. For this man, his long years of suffering encouraged his superstitious beliefs, and these imprisoned him in a hopeless situation. His life revolved around this pool. This is what superstition does. It offers hope, but in reality, it limits our lives. It locks us into ways of seeing the world and ways of behaving that don't encourage growth. Jesus comes along and he shows this man that the real hope for the human condition was not located in superstition or magical beliefs, but in him. The pool doesn't heal. Jesus does. It's Jesus, as the fulfillment of the promise of God, who sets humanity free from harmful ways of being in the world and from harmful ways of relating to each other. Key to this exchange between the man and Jesus is Jesus' challenging question: do you want to be healed? Now, to some, this might seem like a bit of a daft question. Of course he wants to be healed. But it's not that simple. You see, what Jesus was asking this man was, what do you want the most? To hold on to your magical beliefs that are so familiar to you and have been part of your life for 38 years, but which are holding you prisoner in your suffering? Or do you want another way of living? A new life? This is not an easy question to answer, because it demands self-knowledge and it demands insight. It requires courage to look at how we've been behaving, relating to others, running our churches, and to see that what we've been doing has not been helping, but has been propping up a harmful situation. It takes real courage to look honestly at that. The question itself, well, it's as life-changing as the miracle is, because it helps the man to realize how his beliefs have held him prisoner all these years. It gives him the opportunity to want real change and to really want it. The question invites him to consider his relationship with Jesus. Clearly, a relationship of trust is built up here really very quickly so that this man is able to trust Jesus and answer him honestly. The question invites him to consider his relationship with himself as well. Pointlessly staying next to that pool would be an act of self-harm. He needs to have self-regard, self-respect in order to pull himself away. He needs to learn to love himself. And the question, it seems to me, also invites him to consider his relationship with others. He has no one as he sits around that pool, but he's developed a habit of isolating himself so that he never asks anyone for help. Usually we do this because we're afraid that they're going to say no. And so Jesus is inviting him to re-engage with others, to experience their love, and to love them, to re-enter society. The power of this story, then, is that it speaks into our situations. It challenges how we relate to others. It challenges how we relate to ourselves and also how we relate to God. It challenges us to answer the powerful question, do we really want to be healed? Do we really want positive change in our lives? Or do we want to carry on making the same mistakes over and over and over simply because it's familiar? The force of this story is to point us to Jesus as the one who can release us from damaging and unhelpful patterns of relating to others. He shows us what it means to love God, to love ourselves, and also to love others. And through this, he helps us to build better ways of relating.